1961. I was around 7 or 8 years old, running around my native land in West Africa. I was free. I was happy. I was with my family. And then, one day, the evil men came, and they were carrying guns and whips and chains. And they kidnapped me, along with other African men, women, and children, to later be sold into slavery. I remember at first we walked and walked and walked, and my childlike body began to ache, and I became very, very unsteady on my feet. I thought that I was going to faint. But then, up ahead, I saw a ship, and that is where we were headed. I remember walking in back of the other African men, women, and children, and we were headed to the slave galley. And my tired body had enough strength to put one foot in front of the other. And as I was walking down the stairs, there was this terrible stench coming from the room I was about to enter. And when I got closer, what I saw was Africans laying on their backs on a cold floor, bare, handcuffs on their wrists and chains on their feet. They were packed so close together they could hardly move from side to side. And they remained that way day in and day out. And in order for them to take care of their personal needs, they had to take care of it right there on them, like they were animals. They were treated like animals instead of the human beings that they were. And I remember searching the room for a place where I could rest my tired, aching body after that long walk and the journey. And I found a space. And I remember I slid my back up against the wall, and I began to kneel my 7-year-old body down, and I grabbed my knees and held them in my arms, and I started thinking about how my mother felt when she discovered that I had been kidnapped. I wondered if she knew that I was thinking of her. And soon, the room where I was, it was dimly lit, and it started to eventually get dark. And then the darkness turned to very dark, and I could not see anything. But I could hear the moans and the groans of the other people who were also being held captive. And I was very afraid. Can you imagine being 7 years old, snatched away from your family, never to see them again? Anyways, the darkness, I sat there listening to these sounds of people moaning, groaning, and crying. And I became very sad. And I remember thinking that I just wanted to be held in the arms of my mother again, and being kissed on my forehead, and having her tell me that everything was going to be okay. Of course, that was my imagination. I fell off to sleep, only to wake the next day to realize that the horror of being kidnapped was a reality. I remember going on the upper deck of the ship, and the things I saw there were unbearable. They whipped the men and women for no reason at all. And some of the men chose to jump overboard and commit suicide rather than to be held captive. The ship traveled over 4,000 miles from West Africa across the Atlantic Ocean, also known as the Middle Passage, to North America. And some days the seas were nice and calm, and other days they were roaring and they were angry, as if they knew what was taking place, the evil things that were happening on the ship. Now, July 11th, 1761. July 11th, in the year of our Lord, 1761. There I stood on the auction block, waiting to be sold into slavery. I stood there with the others. You see, a man named Thomas Finch had owned the ship that brought us over. And he had arranged in a public place such as this sitting here today for people to come and purchase slaves. It was an advertisement, radio announcements, the same things you would do to advertise a sale is what he did. So there were people, and they were looking and staring and pointing at all of us. And this couple walked toward me, and I stood there not knowing what was about to happen. These people had strange-looking faces, and they were speaking a language I did not know. Soon I was being led off the ship, sold to John and Susanna Wheatley. There was a waiting carriage being driven by someone who was the same complexion as me. And his name was Prince, and he too was a slave. And let me tell you how I got my name. The slave ship that brought me over, it was named Phillis. Imagine that, being named after a slave ship that brought you over. What a constant memory. So they called me Phillis. and I assumed the last name of the people who brought me, Wheatley. They called me Phillis Wheatley. And I remember when we arrived at their home, they lived on King Street, and it was this huge house known as a mansion. You see, the Wheatleys were very wealthy. They were merchants, and they did business in America as well as the West Indies and in London. They had a lot of connections. And I remember that they had two 18-year-old children, well, adults, if you will. They were twins. Their name was Mary and Nathaniel. And they would both be instrumental in my writing journey and my education. You see, Susanna wanted someone to be a servant and also someone who could help read Bible scriptures, because they were Christian people. They believed in going to church and having their children know about God. And so that was their main objective, was to have someone to help out as a servant and someone to read Bible scriptures. So to their surprise, I was taught how to the English language. At the age of 9, not only did I learn the English language, I was also very aggressive in learning. So when I was 12, I learned Greek, Latin, and English. So I studied Greek, Latin, and English literature. And I was just so excited to learn. And when they saw that I had this passion for learning, I did more in education at their home than being a servant. So they allowed their daughter, Mary, to continue to teach me. And sometimes I was self-taught. I used the library that was in their home. And when I was 14 years old, there was two men who came to visit the Wheatley family, and they were talking about a voyage that they had gone on, and that they thought that they were not going to survive. And so as they were sharing their story with the Wheatleys, I was in the background listening very carefully to what they were saying. And later, I was able to take their words and put it on paper. So that was my first opportunity to write a story about something I had heard. And guess what? It was also published in the Newport Mercury News in Rhode Island. My first published piece. I was kind of proud of myself, you know. And then when I was 15, I wrote one of my poems that is recited a lot today. And you may have heard it before. If not, I'll take a moment and share it with you. It's called On Being Brought from Africa to America. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once our redemption neither sought nor knew. And some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. The message in that poem was that no matter what color you are, that God created us all and that we were equal. And I wanted that message in my poem to go out to the Christians, the people who call themselves Christians, but yet they were able to abuse humans. Something to think about, huh? When I was 17 years old, I wrote 3 poems in 1770. But the one that caught the attention was about Reverend George Whitefield. Now, he was a minister and he had traveled around, but while he was traveling and he was in Massachusetts, he actually passed away. And so I wrote a poem about him. Little did I know that Reverend George Whitefield, was friends of Selena Hastings, who lived in London. And my piece was then shared by Susanna Wheatley with her. And that piece became a published piece in London, and I became known as an international poet. I continued to keep writing. When I was 18 years old, I was baptized at the Old South Church. You may have heard about it because it's still standing now. The Old South Church is where I was baptized. And also, a little known fact, Benjamin Franklin was baptized there too. Anyways, I continued to write, and one year my poetry was submitted to be published. And the Publishing Society refused to publish my works. Now keep in mind, my poems had been published in local newspapers and everything, but when it came time to publish a collection of my poetry, they refused to publish it. But that didn't stop Susanna Wheatley, because what she did is she reached out to her friends, including Selena Hastings in London, and she told her about what had happened, and they worked together to get my works published. And in 1773, I traveled to London with young master Nathaniel Wheatley, and he helped me get my poems published. Now, can you imagine the first journey that I came on? I was held as a slave on a slave ship, whereas this was a total opposite. This was joy, because there was an article put in the paper that said, "Ode to America, farewell to America," because I was leaving America and traveling to London. When I boarded that London schooner, I had my own cabin. And people were there, and they were greeting me, and they made me feel like I was human. They treated me with dignity and respect. They asked me to share my poetry with them, and I even wrote a few poems while I was aboard. Arriving in London, people were there to meet and greet me. Again, I felt like I was free. So I met with the London publisher, Archibald Bell, and worked with a lot of other people who were instrumental in publishing my book called Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. 6 weeks after I was in London, I received a call that Susanna Wheatley was ill, so I had to return back home before everything was tied up, loose ends with the book. But you know, in my heart, I knew that all these miracles had taken place to get me from where I was in 1761 on that slave ship to being in London, working with publisher. I knew that a miracle had happened and that my book would be published. So I returned home to be with Miss Susanna Wheatley as she was dealing with health issues. And I was also emancipated. I received my freedom. And on March 1st, 1774, Miss Susanna Wheatley passed away. I was devastated. It meant that I no longer had a person to care for me. I know it was a strange relationship originally. I was a slave, bought to be a slave, but I'm telling you that it developed into much more than that. It was a friendship. She coached me, she mentored me, my #1 fan, and I grieved the loss of her life. And shortly after that, my book was published. Before that, my book was published, so she had an opportunity to see all the work she had done come to a reality, and my book was published in 1773. And a few months later, 6 months later to be exact, she passed away. But I was glad that she had an opportunity to see that. Following that, I married John Peters, and Our life was full of ups and downs. You probably hear some things about him. We had struggles financially. I had 3 children, 2 died in infancy, and the last child died at a young age. And I myself died on December 5th, 1784, died in poverty at the age of 31, buried in an unmarked grave. And today I'd just like to close with an old Negro spiritual. Just a few bars, if you know it. And you just kind of come along with me. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. A long way from home.